Welcome back to the show, Business Mastery for Startups, Scale-Ups, and Early Stage Businesses with your host, Jerry Gadori. That's me. And longtime listeners to the show will recognize someone who's becoming something of a regular, Chris Selland. Now, if you aren't a longtime listener, Chris is a luminary in the local startup community as an investor. His background as a founder in operations, sales, and marketing is going to lend a lot rather to what we talk about today. He also teaches is it Northeastern University, Chris?
I teach at Northeastern, yep.
Yes. So let's hear a little bit more about that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, so I'm a part-time professor at Northeastern. I still struggling with the students call me professor. Some of them are more formal than other, but I don't really think adjunct lecturer, I guess, at Northeastern in the entrepreneurship in the business school and the entrepreneurship and innovation program. And it's great. I've been doing it for a little over a year now. I'm teaching my third and fourth course this semester. I so enjoy working with these students. I mean, it gives me so much optimism about the future, particularly given all the things going on in the world, some good, but some not so good, but sort of seeing the talent, the energy, the enthusiasm, and just the brains that are coming along. It's really fun to work with the students. So it really lights me up.
To say we live in interesting times is an understatement, but I've got to say, I love that there is an entrepreneurship department. That was not a thing when we were kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I teach in the corporate innovation track, which is really mostly around kind of how bigger organizations can become innovative, stay innovative. So as I always say, not become digital, not become Kodak, not become one of these, big companies that gets disrupted by startups, but kind of staying innovative. I'd been acquired by Reuters. I've been acquired by HP. I spent 5 great years at HP after they acquired Vertica Systems, where I was. And so kind of helping these larger entities figure out how to be more entrepreneurial and innovative is really what a lot of the stuff I teach is about. So I really enjoy it. And obviously I draw a lot from my life lessons, and I also bring in a lot of guest speakers as well. I have to have you in sometime.
Would love to.
Yeah.
Is that called the I don't want to be Blockbuster path?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny you say that because I joke, but it's not a joke. I told the students, because I've already learned this lesson and I just rediscovered it a few days ago, just last week, I think. Netflix is like their favorite company to talk about because, first of all, they can relate to it, right? If I start talking about Clayton Christensen, disk drives and backhoes and excavators and, some of the stuff that was in the, not the Discipline of Market Leaders, wrong book, but The Innovator's Dilemma. They can't really relate to that, but Netflix, they can absolutely relate to. And of course, Blockbuster kind of predates a lot of these students, or at least they were very small at the time, but they can certainly relate to Netflix. So I can spend the entire semester talking about Netflix. And, it starts with the disruption of Blockbuster in many ways. I mean, that's not when the company really started, but it's obviously a big part of their early history. So we use that case study heavily.
Yeah, it certainly impacted their hockey stick. I cannot recall the person who said it. He was an Indian gentleman. Oh, what the heck is his name? It'll come to me when it doesn't matter. But he talked about the 2 skills that will set you up for life are selling and building.
Mm-hmm.
If you can sell and if you can build something, then pretty much you can write your ticket. And I think that a lot of the founders companies like Netflix really prove that.
You sure that wasn't Larry Ellison? I always quote Larry Ellison. Larry Ellison basically said, and I might be slightly misquoting, but there's 2 jobs in technology. You build shit and you sell shit. And I do use that, fairly often, even in the class. So
this was for sure an Indian dude, but that sounds like something Larry Ellison would say.
Yeah, it's a variant of the same theme.
Exactly. I typically always default to Mark Twain or Benjamin Franklin because they said about 85% of what's said in our country. So I'm usually safe with one of those 2.
Yeah. Larry's in the news a lot these days, though, yes. And his son. So
for sure. Who thought he would get the second act he did after Oracle kind of started to plateau? Mm-hmm. That's crazy. But anyway.
Absolutely. Anyway.
Here we go again.
Mm-hmm.
Chris and I and our tangents on tangents. So circling back to sales, I had wanted to have you back on the show to run back our Startup Boston where we first met, but you had a pretty exciting panel there from what I understand.
Yeah, no, I participated in a panel with a few other folks. Deborah Kurtz from Magenta Search moderated, Liz Graham from Ada IQ, Hannah Leary, Jennifer Harrington from Hatch Agency. So we had we had a really good panel, and it was about sales. We were saying wasn't necessarily a digression; it was a good segue, but it was really about sales in the early days of a company and when to consider bringing on kind of a real sales leader. In other
I
words,
have
when
thoughts.
should the founders, there's a lot of founders at Startup Boston, consider going to hire somebody to run sales instead of, in many cases, in most cases, doing it themselves. So that was really what we discussed was that transition point.
I like to call that latter example the I'd like to go out of business as quickly as possible path. I am not a fan of companies where the founder or somebody on the founding team, if you have a co-founder, it can be the co-founder. But I think personal opinion from my experience, again, predominantly on the services side, the founder needs to be the initial salesperson. In my
Hmm.
opinion, at least until they've got a rough system and process and a good idea of who the ICP is. Because prior to that, you're just setting your salesperson up to fail.
100%. That's exactly what we talked about. And again, since we were talking very much to kind of a startup audience, a couple of other things I would build on that. What you just said is also, the famous or infamous term product market fit, whether or not you have it. And by the way, if you have any question, if you do, the answer is no, you don't. So because if you have it, it's something that you should be extremely clear about, and very few early stage startups have it. So if you don't have that, trying to bring somebody outside of the founding loop into sales is extremely challenging and
For everybody.
oftentimes going to fail. Right. As a matter of fact, in many cases, not only do they not have product market fit, they might not even have a well defined product. So in the early days, right, you may still be kind of poking around, figuring out what you're trying to do. And, trying to bring in a third party salesperson, head of sales at that point, they can be the most talented salesperson in the world and potentially sales leader, but they're unlikely to be successful just because, what you're building, back to the building shit, selling shit analogy, what you're building, if it's still nebulous, then trying to figure out how to sell it is just extremely difficult. So I would add that. And then the other thing I would also add is, are you raising capital? Because there's just a big difference there. And, when we normally, assuming the founder isn't necessarily always the CEO, but assuming the founder, or at least one of the founders, is in the CEO role, first of all, raising capital is sales. So it's a form of
Yes.
sales. But if you're raising capital, particularly in this day and age, it's a full time job, right? So, and of course, once investors started getting involved, they have expectations around usually around top line revenue growth is the most important part of the plan, right? So how are you going to get there and scalability, right? Investors invest in a company to ultimately scale it. I mean, if they're investing early enough, they hopefully have realistic expectations about when you can really hit that point of scale. So at some point, they're going to want you to bring in a sales organization and a true sales leader to just focus on sales. So if you're raising capital, that point probably gets pushed earlier for all of those reasons. The founder really needs to focus on raising capital. Again, it's sales, but it's not selling to customers and maybe needs some help. And investor expectations around growth and, hitting the plan, building the plan, hitting the plan, meeting the plan, exceeding the plan, and all of that. You need to at least be thinking ahead to that point, even if you're not necessarily hiring somebody right away. So my point is raising capital probably moves that point a little earlier, but it's not something you do before you raise capital. It's more kind of as you are discussions you should be having with your investors around their expectations and of course around the plan so that you kind of put it in at the right time, but that might make it a bit earlier than it would be if you were say bootstrapping the company.
100%. And again, I grew up predominantly in services where getting VC funding is a non-issue because it's rarely
Mm-hmm.
available. So
Mm-hmm.
for us, we're almost always bootstrapped or some other thing, but rarely were we VC funded. But circling back, there's so many important things that happen when the CEO, the founder, is the lead salesperson. When it comes to hiring, obviously, they can define who the ICP is. They can talk through what the process is like. They can explain things that they experienced, common objections, all of those sorts of things. But on top of that, it more clearly defines what they need in the person that they're looking for. Having
Mm-hmm.
hired and led hundreds, probably thousands of sales people over the 30 years that I've been doing this, I can say that there are far more bad matches than there are bad salespeople and bad companies. So if
Mm-hmm.
you get a salesperson, for example, that's accustomed to a very short, high velocity sales process, and then you put them in a slow moving sales process like enterprise sales or gosh, federal sales, it's like molasses in a freezer. They're not equipped for dealing with that. It's too foreign.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I mean, typically, certainly very true in the sort of venture backed startup world, there's always a thought that we should go get a name who's been at Meta, Facebook, Google, Salesforce, Microsoft, and go hire these big name folks because they'll have a playbook and they'll have a strategy and they'll have a team. And yes, they may have all of those things, but whether those things actually fit your organization, your product, the market you're serving is highly questionable. If they don't, trying to kind of map another company or another, leader's playbook onto a business where it doesn't fit can do far more harm than good, for sure. So,
Completely agree. And it's okay with me if you don't agree with me on this. Not everybody does. But I'd argue that if your salesperson, or really nearly anyone you hire into your startup, is coming from an environment that's 10x yours, you're going to have cultural problems. As
yep.
it relates to salespeople specifically, they'll be accustomed to a level of formal framework and support they're not going to have where you are. And I'm not discounting the power of networks and connection. David Chang would never forgive me if I did that. But having said that, in my experience, most salespeople overstate the size and power of the network. I don't think they do it intentionally, but all those doors that they think are going to be wide open seem to get kind of stuck when the time comes, when that potential new client realizes the effort it takes to onboard a completely unknown company.
Absolutely. Well, not surprisingly, good salespeople are good at selling, right?
Yes.
And particularly good at selling themselves. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? It's kind of a natural thing, but oftentimes in sort of an organizational context, sales' job is to sell. It's somebody else's job to deliver. But if you're coming in to run sales, you're selling, but then you're on the hook for delivery. And so it's very typical in the tech world to be selling a little bit ahead of what we actually can deliver, knowing that it's
Guilty.
coming, right? But yeah, everybody does it. It's kind of a
Sell the
natural thing. And
roadmap,
again, it's
baby.
not, yeah, exactly. We're selling the roadmap, but if you're stepping into the role, you have to be realistic. It's funny, just yesterday in one of my classes, I had a guy named Bob Bennett, who is a very successful entrepreneur. I'd say it's funny. Bob is a very quiet, humble guy. He was most recently the CEO of a company called Invoice Cloud, which went through a couple of mergers. It became Engage Smart, went public very successfully, was acquired by private equity. He's still on the board. He's since kind of retired and stepped aside. He's also on the board of Forrester, but I've known Bob for years. He came in to one of my classes and was talking about how, like one of the, if not the most important skills in business is, kind of not underselling, but kind of setting expectations properly. Right.
Yes,
And
agreed.
again, this is something that salespeople tend to err on the side of setting them a little bit too high because they're trying to close the deal. But if you do that and then you're on the hook to deliver, deliver. He was talking about, how his first company was a company called Microfridge. They were growing 30% a year, but he had told the board he could grow 40%. So he was having all these contentious discussions with the board. He's like, I could have just as easily told the board I'd grow 20. They would have been fine with that plan. And, I would have been it would have been much different conversations, right? So no real difference in how the business was doing. It was growing at a healthy rate, but he had set expectations a little bit too high. So he talked a lot about that, and I think it was a good thing for a lot of the students to hear, for sure. So
When I was president of Apicero, we took a lot of tech folks that hadn't consulted before and taught them how to be technical consultants. And the reason for that, very simply, was we're a MuleSoft implementation company, and there just weren't enough MuleSoft folks to go around. So we would train them and teach them how to consult. And consulting 101, and it's true in sales and in leadership as well, it's largely about effectively setting expectations and then managing them. But we're a little bit on a field adjacent to a field next to the field we're supposed to be talking about. So to circle back, so salespeople, or rather founders that are selling, we gave one example of when a founder should consider handing off sales to another person, which is when they start to actively court VCs and go out to get funding. What are some other examples or maybe benchmarks people should be looking for, Chris?
Well, I mean, and I would say, to qualify, I would also say, like, not so much before, but kind of as part of their discussions with investors, they might want to start thinking about it. But I wouldn't necessarily make those investments before you've got the capital raise. Let's put it that way. It'll probably become part of the discussion as part of the process to think about it. I would also say, certainly in the tech community, and my background is mostly in software. A lot of founders are product visionaries. They're on the build shit side of things. They're not natural salespeople. They're not comfortable with the role. And so, yeah, that's a reason that you don't want to own it forever. I would say that, nobody's necessarily as good at selling their vision as the person who has the vision. So to some degree, being the visionary is still a very good, characteristic for selling, but they might not naturally see themselves in that role. They might not be comfortable in that role. And, obviously they are trying to build a business around their product or their service offering. So, in that case, yeah, you need to probably find someone to help, run the sales side of the business. And, you know, that, that's a real reason.
Yes.
The issue though, which I mentioned much earlier, is that just make sure that you've really got it well defined. And well defined, not just what you want to build, but you've got some degree of commercial acceptance, where you've got customers, potential customers saying they're going to pay, ideally paying. Like, you need to get some commercial traction. I just had this with a student the other day, and I had it the week before that with a company I was advising. Like, it is really hard to raise capital right now if you don't have some degree of commercial traction. So you need to be able to show, in other words, product market fit, right? So going out and bringing somebody in, you may not like selling, but if you haven't gotten to that point, it's still going to be very hard for you to hand it off right now. But you might look ahead to the point where you need to get there as quick as possible. You need to have as many customer prospect conversations as you can, and get what you've got in the hands of people to bang on it, test it out, give you feedback. Because getting to that point of product market fit is critical, and that becomes the critical point at when you can really start to think about it. When you at least feel like you have a first rev of that.
I completely agree. When I'm talking to founders, if they're looking to hand that off, and clearly most do, and that's fine. I like selling, so for me, that's something I hold on to for as long as I can. And my general rule when it comes to founders and giving anything other than the CEO ship up, whether they love it or don't,
Mm-hmm.
is you can stay in that until you become a bottleneck. That's the
Mm-hmm.
other side of the equation. But the beginning side of the equation, for me, as it relates to sales, is, do I know who my ideal customer is? Do I understand what will be of interest to them so that I can help lay out how outreach should look? And do I have at least, on a scale of 1 to 10, at least a 7 in how my sales process is defined, so that when I bring a salesperson in, I can explain, this is your target, this is how you reach them, this is how a buying process is going to look. And as importantly, because I've laid that out for that person, I can manage and lead that person. So that's
Mm-hmm.
what I look for on the beginning end myself.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I mean, you touched on something else too that was part of our panel discussion and was actually, I think, in a lot of respects, the biggest and maybe the most controversial part, which is yes, if you're bringing in that first salesperson, you may not be looking for, but in all likelihood, also, they're also expecting that this is going to kind of be a player coach role. So this is going to be somebody who's going to figure out the model and then start to build a team and an organization to scale the model. And, is that sort of player coach personality somebody who can be the first kind of doer, but then once they figured out how to do it, can then build an organization to, they can teach it and they can scale it, right? So, and there was a lot of back and forth about whether that person really exists. I think they do. I've worked with a few who, are pretty talented at kind of, getting it done by themselves, figuring out the model and then figuring out how to build a team, but it's hard to find for sure. So that's kind of the next stage, right? It's not just when should the founder hand off sales, but then do they bring in a salesperson to do it in the near term, but then build the organization over the long term? You might also bring in somebody more junior who doesn't necessarily just hire a first sales rep, who doesn't have the expectation that they're going to run the sales organization as they figure out the model. But for the most part, particularly in early stage companies, when you're pulling somebody out of a job, they're making a lot of money, you're probably giving them a lot of equity. They're probably walking in with the expectation that, like, yeah, I'm going to figure out the model and then I'm going to build the team and I'm going to lead the team. So, but those are two different jobs, right? So, and somebody who's good at both of those jobs is a rare hire. Let's just leave it there. So,
Good salespeople are rare. Good sales leaders are rarer. And
mhm.
good people are good at both are rarer still. They do exist. I'm with you on that. But
Yep.
I've met countless salespeople that are exceptional at what they do, but were horrible leaders. And that's a whole conversation for another day. I will say, again, something we talked about earlier, setting and managing expectation. It's critical that you're clear with the person that you're bringing in. It's also critical, and this is probably one of the biggest mistakes I see, is when that founder hires a salesperson, they have a tendency to turn that part of their brain off and allow that person to autopilot. And it's a huge mistake for a lot of reasons. Number one, you never want to leave people unled in your team. But number two, there's just so, I don't want to make this sound like mysticism instead of science, but there's so many things that can go wrong in a fledgling sales environment. The CEO, founder, someone in the founding team needs to be monitoring that closely to ensure it's developing the way that they want
Hmm.
it to. And I hate to say this as a lifelong sales guy, they've got to be ready to make changes if it's not. The worst
Hmm.
thing they can do is allow a bad culture to form from the start.
Right. You mean organizational changes as opposed to product changes? Yeah. 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 No, absolutely. That has to stay connected. I mean, when I talk about that build shit, sell shit example that we talked about earlier, I'll often say, the real key to success is being able to tie those things together to make
Yes.
sure we're building what we can sell and we're selling what we can build and we're doing it in a scalable way, right? So those can't be islands. So the builder founder can't just sort of retreat to going back to writing code and let somebody else run sales, because in all likelihood what's going to happen very quickly is those things are going to go out of alignment and you'll have sales selling what we never envisioned building, what we don't have, and then we have to scramble to build it because they committed it and sold it to somebody, and then it takes us off track. And so that's, and that, as organizations start to scale, to me that role is product, which I always kind of define, or you could call it service delivery in a services organization, which is the most kind of critical kind of glue role in many software companies in particular, which is most of where my background is, which is making sure that sell it motion and the build it motion and all of the functions kind of tie together. So we're creating kind of a virtuous cycle. We're selling what we can build and we're building what we can sell. So, and yeah, if you just let sales go off on their own, it's going to go out of whack almost certainly, and often quite quickly. So,
There's going to be
and it
fist
might not even
fights
be the fault, right? Yeah.
there's going to be fist fights in the break room between sales and software development. So I will say, flipping the conversation a little bit, one thing to keep in mind though, even if you are a founder that loves sales, when you start to think about exit, you need to ensure that you're not running sales at that point. The more tied you are to individual clients, the less a potential buyer can see a path to success without you. The less your valuation, the harder the sale, and the more long term your tie to the new company will be.
Yeah, yeah. I think in a founder-led sales, which many organizations are, yeah, that can be a real risk, because certainly in an M&A situation, I mean, most of the companies we were talking to at Startup Boston who were in the audience were far from that point. So
Right, right, right.
that's a issue for down the line. But yeah, that's something to certainly keep in mind. That's building a scalable business, right? So
Yes.
that a buyer is buying a business. They're not just buying some people, basically, because if the relationships go with the people and there's only a small number of people, well, then what's the business really worth, right? So either I'll just hire the people, or put the type of valuation on it, realizing the founders are gonna. It's funny, Bob kind of talked about that in the class too. The founders are going to step away at some point. They might have an earnout or some incentives to stick around for a while, but they're not going to, likely stick around forever. Sometimes they do, but yeah, that's definitely a consideration for sure.
So we covered a lot of ground today, Chris. If you could give a startup founder, any startup founder, one piece of advice, what do you think that would be?
Yeah, well, I work with a lot of startup founders. I mean, I am an angel investor. I wouldn't say I'm a super active angel investor. I'm part of TBD Angels, which is an angel group in the Boston area, and then I'm part of the venture mentoring group at Northeastern too. And I have a couple of mentees that I talk to about this sort of thing all the time. And it's really just demonstrate, pursue, and demonstrate commercial traction as early as possible. Everybody wants to, particularly the sort of engineering type product visionary founders, they want to retreat into the lab and focus on what they're building. You got to get out there and talk to customers, and you've got to get potential customers, and you've got to get some of them bought in. It's almost impossible to raise capital, at least as a first-time founder, if you haven't done that. I mean, if you've been successful, if you've made money for investors previously, different story. But assuming this is your first go around, you got to get out there and talk to customers. So that's the biggest thing. And you got to be able to demonstrate some form of commercial traction, ideally paying customers, or at least customers who are committed to paying. If once you can deliver what you might need some capital to fully deliver, or even trials. But get out there in the market as early as you can. It's probably the biggest point of advice I can give, because a surprising number of startups, they don't want to do that. That's not what they're thinking. And that's where they think, oh, I have to go hire a salesperson. But that's not necessarily the answer. It's, as we were kind of circling back, bringing us full circle to what we were saying before, it's really, the founders have to get out there and be parts of those conversations. So, because, it's the really the only path to success these days. The days of I have an idea and VCs are going to throw money at me are long over, unless you're the kind of entrepreneur that's already, created exits and created value for those VCs. Then they might talk to you because they've seen you do it before. But if you're the first time in the seat, you got to get out there as early as you can and as often as you can.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'll take the VC part of it out of the equation and say, if you're not consistently talking to to prospects and to clients, that's when you wind up building something that you think is cool, but that the market doesn't necessarily care about. And I know this because I did it.
Yeah. 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 Well, and also, by the way, I would say 1B as well when I'm talking to startup founders. And I do feel this is starting to change, but we still have a long way to go. And your background in services, you already alluded to it, but it's that realize there's alternative paths to the VC path. I mean,
Yes.
That's particularly as a, professor entrepreneurship and talking to students early in their careers. I'm trying to drive this point home all the time that, the venture game is a tough one, and it only fits certain types of companies. And there are a lot
Less
of
than 15%.
interesting, creative, viable businesses that, can and should be started, founded, grown, but they're not necessarily fit for venture. So realize there are all kinds of alternatives out there and all kinds of models. And again, I think that's becoming a little better understood in the market, but the VC path is not the only path, is something very important to keep in mind too. For some companies, it's the right path, but for a lot, it's really not. And if you try to go down that path and it's not a fit for your business, first of all, you're probably not going to make it. But even if you make it, you might wind up, down the road in a situation you're not happy to be in. So, or your investors. It's hard because, in the early days of a company, it's very hard to see the future fully, but you have to kind of recognize the potential scalability and whether it really fits the VC model, and to at least be thinking about that as you make these decisions as early as possible is really, really important.
I couldn't agree more. And I'll take it one step further and say, even if VC is your path, the further you can delay that without hurting your company, the more autonomy you're likely to retain and more equity you're likely to keep. But I'm going to stop there because we're starting a whole nother conversation. So, Chris, if people want to learn more about you and contact you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, I mean, best way is via LinkedIn, and I can, I think you have that, but I can send you, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I've been using LinkedIn. LinkedIn's a great tool. My bio's up on the Northeastern website. I do a little writing also for CIO.com, so you can find me there as well. But LinkedIn's probably the best place to find me these days. So, and you can find me on the other socials, although I don't spend as much time on them. I think from a business perspective, LinkedIn is certainly the most important place to be these days, and that's usually the best place to find me.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I should be on X more. I just don't hate myself enough to do it.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time on X in the past. I don't spend a lot. I go on occasionally, but I don't spend a lot of time there either these days. So
yes,
it's got
I'm
too
on
political,
LinkedIn.
unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. That's it. But listen, Chris, obviously we have to have you back. I'm beginning to think we should do a standing quarterly date because we could talk for hours.
Sure. Yeah.
So that'll be it for today, though. We're already over time, as is often the case when we talk. So thanks for being on. You're a wonderful guest as always, and I look forward to the next time.
Sounds great. Pleasure as always.
Thank you, Chris.
All right, Jerry. Take care. Bye-bye.